A group of kids kept running through my garden, destroying my flowers. I spoke to their parents, but they laughed and said, "Boys will be boys." One morning, I woke up to find my entire yard trampled and my fence kicked down. Furious, I set a trap. The next night, I heard screaming, and when the parents saw what I had done, they merely fainted. I never wanted to be that neighbor, but when you spend years growing a garden only for it to get destroyed over and over, something inside you just snaps. This all started when a new family moved into the house at the end of our street. It was a quiet neighborhood just outside of Chicago, where people took pride in their homes, and kids mostly played in their own yards or the park down the street. That all changed when the McCormicks moved in. They had 3 boys, all under 12, but built like football players and absolutely out of control. It started with small things. I noticed them running through my front yard when they were cutting across the neighborhood. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then I saw one of them stomp through my flower bed like it was just part of the sidewalk. My tulips were crushed. My first reaction was to be reasonable. I walked down to their house and knocked. Their mom, Brenda, answered. She had this disinterested look, like I had just interrupted her soap opera. I kept my voice calm and polite. "Hey, I live a few houses down. I just wanted to ask if you could tell your kids not to cut through my yard. They trampled my flowers." Brenda laughed, actually laughed. "Oh, that? Come on, they're just kids. They don't mean any harm." "They killed my flowers," I said, still trying to be nice. She waved her hand like I had just told her it might rain later. "It's just some flowers. They'll grow back." At that point, I realized I wasn't going to get anywhere with her, so I walked away, figuring maybe they'd stop now that I'd said something. But I was wrong. It got worse. I started seeing them run through my yard multiple times a day. I caught them jumping over my small wooden fence like it was some kind of hurdle course. Every time I tried to talk to them, they just ran off laughing. One day, I saw the youngest one pick up a rock and throw it at one of my garden gnomes, shattering it into pieces. That was it. I marched straight back to their house, knocked louder, and this time, Brenda's husband, Steve, answered. "Your kids are destroying my yard," I said, furious. Steve just smirked. "You again. Thought we talked about this. They're just having fun. Boys will be boys." I clenched my jaw so hard I thought my teeth might crack. "They broke my gnome. They're ruining my plants." He shrugged. "Then don't put breakable stuff outside." At that point, I realized these people didn't care. They weren't going to discipline their kids. I thought about calling the HOA, but honestly, the HOA in my neighborhood was useless. I figured maybe I'd try a different approach. I went to the hardware store and bought a higher fence to replace my little decorative one. I spent an entire weekend installing it, hoping that would be enough to keep them out. The next morning, I walked outside and saw my entire yard destroyed. My flower beds were dug up, my garden lights were broken, my brand new fence completely knocked down, like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. There were muddy footprints everywhere. They had intentionally wrecked my yard. I was seeing red. This wasn't just kids being kids. This was vandalism. I stormed back to their house, pounded on the door, and when Brenda answered, I was already shouting. "Your kids destroyed my yard!" She raised an eyebrow. "Prove it." I gestured wildly. "I can literally show you the footprints." She gave me this smug smile. "Kids run around. You can't prove it was my kids." I stared at her, completely stunned. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break something. But I took a deep breath, stepped back, and realized I wasn't going to waste another second trying to reason with these people. I was going to make sure they never stepped in my yard again. I had a friend, Joe, who owned a farm outside the city. He had an electric fence around his property to keep his livestock from wandering. I called him up, explained the situation, and he started laughing before I even finished. Oh man, I got just the thing for you, Sitye. Now, I knew I couldn't just go putting an electric fence around my yard. That would be illegal. And honestly, I didn't want to actually hurt anyone. But Joe had a better idea. He lent me a low-voltage animal training mat, the kind that gives a tiny static shock when stepped on. It was meant for keeping dogs from digging in flower beds. Totally harmless, but very unpleasant. That was just the first part. Next, I installed motion-activated sprinklers around the yard. These were meant to keep deer away, but they had great water pressure. If anything moved within range, they'd go off, spraying freezing cold water in all directions. And for the final touch, I set up a motion-activated speaker. I downloaded the most demonic, ungodly growl I could find online. Something straight out of a horror movie. I tested it late at night, and even I got goosebumps hearing it. Then I waited. Sure enough, that night I heard them, the sound of sneakers slapping against pavement, the hushed giggles. They were coming. I turned off my porch light and peeked through the blinds. The first boy ran into the yard and stepped right onto the mat. Zap! He screamed and jumped back so fast he tripped over his own feet. The second boy tried to push forward, and the sprinklers exploded to life, blasting them with ice-cold water. Then came the growl. It was deep, guttural, and sounded like a demon crawling out of the ground. All three boys screamed like they were being murdered. They turned and ran, slipping in the mud, their clothes soaked, their hair standing on end from the shock. I nearly died laughing. But the best part? Their parents came running. Brenda and Steve stormed out of their house, yelling. They didn't even hesitate before charging onto my yard. Zap! Brenda shrieked. Steve actually fell backward into the mud. They scrambled to their feet, soaked and shaking, their faces a mix of fury and pure confusion. I stepped out onto my porch, completely calm. Oh, having some trouble? Steve was livid. What the hell did you do? I crossed my arms. I just protected my property. Maybe now your kids will stop destroying it. Brenda's face was red with rage. I'm calling the police! This is illegal! I smiled. Sure. Call them. I have security footage of your kids trespassing and destroying my yard. Let's see who gets in trouble. She opened her mouth, then shut it. She knew I wasn't bluffing. Your kids owe me for the damage. I continued. Either they fix my garden or I take legal action. For the first time ever, Steve didn't have a smart remark. He just clenched his fists and looked away. And the next morning, those little monsters were in my yard, replanting every single flower. I wasn't even halfway done with them. Watching those kids on their hands and knees, digging in the dirt to fix what they destroyed, should have been the most satisfying thing in the world. But I knew better. People like the McCormicks didn't learn their lesson in one night. This wasn't over. The boys grumbled under their breath as they worked, but every time they slowed down, I cleared my throat and they jumped back into action. Brenda stood on her porch, arms crossed, glaring at me like I had done something wrong. Steve wasn't outside. That worried me. As soon as the kids finished, they stomped off without so much as a word. The moment they got inside, Brenda slammed the door so hard it rattled the windows. I knew that wasn't the end of it. The McCormicks were going to try something. I just didn't know what. It started small. The next morning, I found trash in my yard. A crumpled fast food bag, an empty soda can, and a half-eaten candy bar still in its wrapper. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it had blown in from the street. I picked it up, threw it away, and went about my day. Then it happened again, and again, and again. Every morning, new garbage. And not just normal litter, it was placed. An empty ketchup packet, torn open and squeezed onto my garden gnome. A milkshake cup, dumped upside down, the sticky mess soaking into my mulch. One day, I found a full bag of dog poop, tied neatly and sitting right in the middle of my walkway. I checked my security cameras, but whoever was doing it knew where they were. They stayed just out of view. I knew it was the McCormicks. I marched over there and knocked. Hard. Steve answered this time, looking smug. "Can I help you?" I held up a soda can. "You want to explain why this keeps ending up in my yard?" He shrugged. "Looks like litter. Maybe the wind blew it over." I clenched my jaw. "The wind doesn't squeeze ketchup onto garden gnomes." He grinned. "Guess you got a real mystery on your hands then." I wanted to punch him right in the mouth, but I wasn't about to let this turn into some childish back-and-forth game. I smiled instead. "All right," I said, my voice cool. "Guess I'll just have to install more cameras." That wiped the smirk off his face. I wasn't bluffing. That night, I installed 2 more cameras, one hidden in a tree facing my garden, and another tucked under my porch roof, aimed at my walkway. Then I waited. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. Motion detected. I opened the camera feed and my blood ran cold. Steve, full-grown, 40-something-year-old Steve, creeping through my yard. I watched in real time as he reached into a plastic bag and started dumping something into my flower beds. He moved quickly, shaking it out all over the soil. When he was done, he hurried back across the street like some kind of cartoon villain. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside. My flower bed was covered in salt. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't just trash. He was trying to kill my garden. I stood there, shaking with rage. I knew what salt did to soil. It poisoned it. Nothing would grow there for months, maybe longer. And he'd done it in the dead of night. Like a coward, I took pictures. Then I called the police. The cops arrived within 10 minutes. I showed them the footage. They took one look at it and walked straight to the McCormicks' door. I followed, standing back as they knocked. Steve answered, looking groggy and annoyed. One of the officers said, "Sir, we need to talk." Brenda appeared behind him. "What's going on?" The officer turned to me. "You want to explain?" I stepped forward. "I have security footage of your husband sneaking into my yard and pouring salt in my garden. That's criminal damage to property." Brenda's eyes widened. Steve turned red. "That's ridiculous!" he snapped. The cop held up my phone, showing the paused footage. Clear as day, Steve's mouth opened, then closed. He had nothing. The officer sighed. "Sir, you're under arrest for trespassing and property damage." Brenda exploded. "Are you serious?" I had never been more serious in my life. They cuffed Steve right there on his porch while Brenda shrieked at them. The kids stood in the doorway, watching, eyes huge. One of them started crying. As they put him in the car, he turned to me and hissed, "You'll regret this." I smiled. "Guess you got a real mystery on your hands then." They drove him away, but I knew this wasn't over. Brenda wasn't going to let this go. And I was right. I thought Steve getting arrested would be the end of it. I thought maybe, just maybe, Brenda would take this as a sign to keep her head down and move on. But I underestimated her pettiness. Steve was out on bail within 24 hours. I saw him standing on his porch the next evening, arms crossed, glaring at me like I was the one who had poured salt in my own garden. Brenda was pacing, talking furiously on her phone. The kids were nowhere in sight. The whole house radiated bad energy. That night, I barely slept. I kept waiting for something. I didn't know what, but I could feel it coming. I locked my doors, checked my cameras twice, and made sure my motion sensors were on. At 3:00 a.m., my phone buzzed. Motion detected. I opened the camera feed, and what I saw made my stomach drop. Flames. Someone had lit my trash can on fire. I bolted outside with the fire extinguisher. The flames were small, mostly licking the edge of my driveway, but the intent was clear. This wasn't meant just harassment anymore. It's a little more. This was arson. I put the fire out fast, my hands shaking as I scanned the street, looking for movement. The McCormick's house was dark. No sign of anyone. But I knew it was them. I checked my cameras, hoping for a clear face. And then I saw it. A hooded figure, too tall to be the kids, too lean to be Steve. And then it hit me. Brenda. I clenched my fists. She wanted war? She was going to get one. The next morning, I walked straight into the police station with my phone in hand. The officer at the desk recognized me immediately. You again, he sighed. I nodded. Yeah, and this time it's arson. I showed them the footage. They watched carefully. Then one of them frowned. Looks like a woman. I smiled. You got one guess who. The officer sighed again, but this time he picked up the phone. We'll pay them another visit. Less than an hour later, a police cruiser rolled up to the McCormick's house. I stood on my porch and watched. Brenda answered the door. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I saw the moment she realized she was caught. Her mouth opened, then shut. Her hands went to her hips. Then she started yelling. Steve came outside next, already fuming. But after a few minutes, the officers turned around and left. No handcuffs, no arrest. I walked over to my mailbox. I just happened to be outside. Brenda saw me and smirked. They can't prove anything, she said. I smiled back. Guess we'll see about that. That afternoon, something strange happened. A knock at my door. I opened it and saw a teenage girl, probably 15 or 16, standing there, shifting from foot to foot. I recognized her immediately. She was the girl from 2 doors down, Olivia. She hesitated. I think you should see something. I frowned. What is it? She held up her phone. She had recorded the whole thing. Brenda sneaking out in the middle of the night, setting the fire, then running back into her house. I stared at the screen, barely able to process what I was seeing. Why are you showing me this? I asked. Olivia shrugged. She's been awful to me, too. Her kids threw eggs at my dog last week. My mom wouldn't let me do anything about it, but I thought you might. I looked up at her. This kid had more guts than half the adults on this street. I smiled. Olivia, you just became my favorite neighbor. I didn't even wait. I forwarded the video to the police and drove straight to the station. This time, when the cops showed up at the McCormick's house, there was no arguing, no smug smiles, no denying. Brenda was arrested on the spot. Steve exploded, yelling and swearing at the cops. He turned on me, pointing and screaming that I had ruined their lives. The officers had to hold him back as they put Brenda in the car. And as they drove her away, I stood on my porch and waved. But I knew Steve wasn't done, and I was right. Steve didn't take Brenda's arrest well. For the next few days, he stomped around like a storm cloud, slamming car doors, muttering under his breath every time he saw me. His kids weren't in school. I imagined they were holed up inside, confused, scared, or maybe just marinating in their father's rage. The entire street had gone quiet. The neighbors knew. The cops showing up again wasn't exactly subtle, and the video Olivia had taken had spread. People whispered. Some avoided eye contact. Others gave me knowing nods, silent approval. The McCormick's had made their bed, and now they were lying in it. Then on the third night after Brenda's arrest, it happened. It was late. I had just finished watering what remained of my garden when I heard something. A noise at the edge of my property. A shuffle. I turned. Steve, standing at the curb, just staring at me. His eyes were wild, red-rimmed, his fists clenched and unclenched at his sides. He was a man unraveling. I didn't speak first. I just waited. You think you've won? He finally spat. I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice even. Steve, go home. You took everything from me, he barked, stepping closer. My wife's in jail. My kids won't talk to me. The whole damn neighborhood's treating us like we're the devil. You did that to yourself. He let out a bitter laugh. You did this. You and that nosy little brat next door. I took a step forward, lowering my voice. Your wife committed arson, Steve. That's not something you just get to laugh off. And you poisoned my yard. You let your kids destroy my property. You started this war, and you lost. His breath hitched. His hands twitched. He was going to swing. I could see it in his eyes. And then, Dad, stop! One of his kids, the oldest, a boy around 12, standing on their porch, barefoot. His face was pale. Steve turned, his face contorted into something between fury and heartbreak. Go inside, Jason. Jason shook his head. I know what you did, Dad. Mom told me. Steve stiffened. She said you told her to do it. Jason continued. She said it was your idea. I stared at the boy, shocked. Even I hadn't seen that twist coming. Jason swallowed hard. You kept saying it was his fault, he said, pointing at me. But you made Mom do it. You told her the cops wouldn't believe him, that they'd just think it was some dumb kids. But you were wrong. Steve's face twisted. Your mother was trying to protect us, Jason's voice cracked. She lit a fire, Dad. What if it had spread? What if someone got hurt? Silence. Steve swayed slightly, like his own son's words had physically hit him. Then Jason turned to me. His lip trembled, but he squared his shoulders. I'm sorry, he said, for everything. I didn't know how bad it was until Mom got taken away. I just thought it was funny, but it wasn't. The kid looked me dead in the eye, and I could see it. He meant it. I nodded slowly. I appreciate that, Jason. Steve inhaled sharply. His hands were still clenched. But now, he just looked small, like all the fight had been drained out of him. He looked at his son, then at me, and then finally at his ruined house. And he turned. Without another word, he walked inside. Jason hesitated, gave me one last nod, and followed. Brenda stayed in jail for a few weeks before getting released on probation. She didn't come to say anything to me, and I didn't go looking for her. She and Steve must have had some kind of reckoning behind closed doors, because within a month, a "for sale" sign was planted in their front yard. They were gone by the end of summer. No dramatic farewell, no parting words. Just gone. I don't know what happened to them after that. Maybe they tried to start over somewhere else. Maybe they just brought their mess to another neighborhood. But something stuck with me. A few months after they left, I was outside trimming some hedges when I heard a voice. Hey, mister. I turned. It was Jason. I barely recognized him at first. He looked calmer, less like a kid who had spent his whole life running from trouble, and more like someone figuring things out. You guys moved, I said, surprised. He nodded. Yeah, new school, new house, it's better. I gave him a small smile. Good. He hesitated, then looked at my garden. It looks nice, I chuckled. Thanks. No one's been stomping through it lately. Jason shifted on his feet. I wanted to say... He swallowed. I wanted to say I really am sorry. I should have stopped when you first told us. It wasn't funny. And I get that, no. I studied him for a moment, then nodded. Takes a big person to admit that, Jason. He kicked a rock. I just didn't want you to think I was like them. I sighed. You're not. His shoulders relaxed. Then he grinned. Oh, and guess what? What? My mom made my dad take gardening classes. Said if he was going to ruin someone's yard, he better know how much work it actually takes. I laughed. A real laugh. Jason smiled. See you around, Mr. And then he jogged off. After they left, the neighborhood went back to normal. Olivia and I became unlikely friends. She'd swing by with her dog. We'd chat sometimes, share gossip about new neighbors. The kids in the area stopped cutting through my yard. People even started planting their own flowers. And me, I sat on my porch every evening, looked at my garden, and breathed easy. Because some battles aren't about winning. Sometimes it's just about proving you won't be stepped on.